Welcome everyone. Hopefully everybody's into the room right now. Welcome to the Education Town Hall Policy Solutions for COVID-19. Students, please use the Q&A function for this event. The LULAC National Educational Service Centers is pleased to host this town hall focused on solutions to the negative impacts of COVID-19 on education. Leaders in nonprofit organizations will participate in these discussions as part of Washington Youth Leadership Seminar, which is a leadership program for high school juniors and seniors. Panelists, if you have a video or presentation, we ask that you keep it between 2 and 3 minutes so we can focus on the dialogue. I'd like to introduce this afternoon moderator Andrea Martinez. She is the host of Pulso News by Telemundo on Quibi, Telemundo's first ever digital English-speaking newscast. Born and raised to Colombian parents in South Florida, prior to Pulso News, she worked as a reporter at NBC6 in her hometown of Miami, Florida. Washington Youth Leadership participants, ladies and gentlemen, your moderator for the Education Town Hall Policy Solutions for COVID-19, Ms. Andrea Martinez.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Thank you for having me. Like you mentioned, I'm the host of Pulso News, Telemundo's first ever digital and English-speaking newscast on Quibi. We appeal to millennials and young Latinxes in the country who speak Spanish and English. The show is really for them, their friends, their families, and the issues that their community cares about. I am thrilled to be your moderator today, and you know, as we've seen this year, it's been a difficult year for all of us. It's brought so many challenges. Of course, the loss of so many lives in our country, but also, you know, the situation that has been created in our schools, the disruption of the school system, of our education system. It's the largest in history, unprecedented. And it's really kind of opening up those gaps in education for low-income students, for students of color, and that's kind of what we've seen, and that's why we're here today, to figure out solutions to all of this. So thank you, all of you, for being here. I'm going to introduce the panelists. Yeah? Okay. So first up, we have Sindy Benavides. Sindy, hi. Sindy is Chief Executive Officer, League of United Latin Americans of LULAC. She's from Honduras, American immigrant, and she has experienced the American dream. She devotes her career to public service now. Sindy, thank you for being here.
Muchísimas gracias, Andrea, and to LNESC. Thank you for all that you do every single day. You know, what individuals don't know is that the scholarships that LNESC has given throughout so many decades has impacted so many leaders across this country, leaders like astronaut Jose Hernández, like Governor Sandoval in Nevada, and so many others that we meet all the time on the street and events across the country. And to our youth who are here with us today, gracias for taking time out to be here, to hear about these issues, to be involved, and to take action.
Thank you, Sindy. Next, we have Luis Maldonado. Luis is Vice President of Government Relations and Policy Analysis at the American Association of State Colleges and Universities. Luis, thank you for being here.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And next we have Karla Hernández-Mats. Karla, the President of the United Teachers of Dade, which is the largest teachers union in the Southeastern United States. A warm welcome to all of you. And again, thank you for being here. And with that, I'm going to open and begin today's town hall and open the floor for some opening statements. So Sindy, I guess we'll start with you.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for being part of this panel. Something that I would say an issue that's probably one of the most critical issues as we're looking at COVID-19. And, you know, for those of you who don't know LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, we are 91 years young, 91 years strong. And during COVID-19, we have been at the forefront of protecting and defending our Latino community, our Latinx community. You know, at the very beginning of this in March, when we reached out to the CDC and asked them for COVID-19 resources in Spanish, their response was, we don't have it and we don't know when we're going to have it. And a poor response by the federal agency. Obviously, we've seen that COVID-19 has disproportionately impacted Latinos across the country. But more than that, as we look at education and the fact that we have had to pivot to online learning, and Karla, I can't even imagine the challenges that you're facing as you represent our teachers in a very, very large county in Florida. We know directly from the parents and from the students the challenges that they're facing, not only in having access to technology, and we know that 1 in 3 Latino families do not have a computer nor access to broadband at home, but also that so many of our community members are facing unemployment because they work in industries that were furloughed or industries that since COVID-19 started have shut down. We also know that many of our children are facing food insecurity. And I just want to uplift the story that, I personally heard about as we were doing our food hunger movement and initiative across the US here in my own backyard of Virginia. We were at an event, and as we were giving out the different food items, one of the family members told us, Ms. Benavides, right now we're trying to figure out if we can buy aceite, maíz, and frijoles, o comprar detergente para lavar la ropa. And our families are literally having to decide between purchasing the very basic staples to be able to feed their families, or purchasing other necessary items to keep their families also safe. And I just want to paint that because that's the reality that so many of our families are facing at this moment. To our students, you are so brave. I just, my heart goes out to you because many of us don't understand the challenges that you may be facing, but know that you are the reason of our existence and that we are here to fight, to protect, to defend you, to make sure that these Congress members and also folks at the state level and at the local level understand that we have a voice and that we will not be silent. Estamos aquí con ustedes. Gracias.
Thank you, Sindy. Up next, Luis.
Thank you, Andrea. Let me very quickly share this part of my screen. One of the things about February of 2019, I came across this tweet of this woman, as you can see the image there on the screen, where she was balancing and playing with a soccer ball. And she was doing what only Messi or Ronaldo can do. But the quote that got associated with the tweet was very telling. Talent is equally distributed around the world, but opportunity is not. And that is at the heart of what we do at the American Association of Psychologists Universities in opening doors for all students to be able to access higher education. Very briefly, I wanted to share with you that AASCU, as we know, represent 41% of the nation's public four-year institutions. We enroll 39% of the nation's 9 million undergraduate students at four-year institutions. And we offer 45% or 1.3 million bachelor's degrees each year among public universities. We have a national footprint across the states, but what I really wanted to focus on and share with all of you today was this graph, this table. I ask you to look at specifically at the Hispanic column. Between the years 2008 and 2019, Hispanic enrollment in colleges and universities has gone up 55%. Between the year 2008 and 2027, it is projected to have gone up by 72%. Compare that to the other groups you see there between white students, Black students, and Asian students. Hispanics in many regards are the future of higher education in this country, and that means the economy and society. It is vital that we fix the policy issues associated with promoting access and retention, ultimately success in higher education, and AASCU is at the heart of that conversation. And I look forward to the conversation we'll be having as a group on this very important topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luis. Karla, you're up next.
Well, hi, everybody. Nice to meet you virtually. I'm Karla Hernández-Mats, president of the United Teachers of Dade out of Miami-Dade, Florida. And look, you know, we know that this pandemic has really highlighted the inequities that exist in our country and really around the world. And when we look at our communities of color, our Black and brown communities, we realize how much more of an impact it has had to our families. And I say that with personal experience. I've had 6 family members that have tested COVID positive. I had an uncle that was on a ventilator for 40 days. And my grandmother passed away from COVID 4 weeks ago. And so we see how this is impacting communities. Of course, as my sister Sindy said, you know, in large urban districts, you see it even more prevalent. Here in Miami-Dade, our school system teaches children that speak over 70 languages. And so we know that some of these, you know, children come, a lot of them do come from Latin America, but just from different parts of the entire world. And so, you know, and everything happened and highlighted all these things, including things that we need to fix in order to have racial justice, right? We cannot take for granted, you know, the verdict, what happened yesterday, that we need to dismantle systemic racism, that all these things impact Black and brown communities throughout the country. And so here, as the president of a labor organization, I think that now more than ever, we can highlight how our teachers' working conditions are directly tied to our students' learning environment. So when teachers are fighting for proper PPE, for proper ventilation, for adequate spacing, for small class sizes, I mean, things that, you know, you probably have heard, you know, throughout your lives, while you were going to school. You know, these are things that teachers, that educators have been fighting for, because we understand that when we're fighting for something, for labor, we're fighting for the children and the community that we represent as well, because your learning environment is our working condition. And so I think that now more than ever, understanding how important unions are and the labor organization and organizing around these issues. How do we create this equity? How do we make sure that we get funding for public education? How do we minimize achievement gaps? How do we dismantle systemic racism? I mean, these are all topics that are being discussed right now. And I'm sure topics that everyone, not only on the panel, but of course our listening and viewing audience are interested in. And I'm super excited about delving into all of that kind of dialogue. So happy to be here.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And absolutely, we're going to be digging into all of those topics. So thank you for that. And with that, I guess we will start our discussion. And the first question is going to be open to all panelists. I want to ask, what steps can the federal government take to support education institutions in their efforts to open classroom instruction in a safe manner while reducing transmission? Karla, I want to start with you. Miami-Dade schools, they open mid-October. The vote just passed. So go ahead, answer this question.
Yeah, our school system, our district is probably one of the last districts in the state of Florida to reopen in person, face-to-face. And, you know, we have taken extra precautions because Miami-Dade has been the epicenter of COVID spread for the state of Florida. And so we have been under stricter guidelines. But really what the federal government can do, unfortunately, it seems like they're not willing to do. So a few months ago, the HEROES Act was passed by Congress. And so in the HEROES Act, there would have been additional money that would have been part of the funding and the resources that schools need in order to open with safety precautions. You know, when you talk about PPE, when you talk about all these different things that are needed in a school system, in an environment to keep everybody safe, you have to talk about funding. And so although Congress passed it, we saw that, you know, it hasn't moved on the Senate side. Now we hear that Congress is drafting a different kind of legislation that will hopefully, you know, gain some legs in the Senate side and be passed. But the reality is that we need our federal government to really invest, double down on the things that we've been talking about. Achievement gaps have existed. We know that these gaps have existed in low socioeconomic areas. And most of the times, those are Black and brown, those are marginalized communities. And so if there was a gap before, this COVID, being away from school, having to do everything virtual, has only, exacerbated that and made that gap even wider. And so if we're really serious about taking care of communities and making sure that children get the proper education, then you say, how do I insert more funds in there so that they have the things that they need, like wraparound services, like making sure that, all these community centers are open so that kids can continue to get the resources and the access to education that they need so that they can survive and thrive. So, I'm hopeful that hopefully, something else will come out of Congress that will actually gain traction from the Senate side. But our federal government has not been doing its due diligence, and they have not funded public education properly for decades now. And it's something that we're feeling the impacts of even more so right now during this pandemic.
Thank you, Karla. Luis, did you want to follow up to that?
Is he
Luis,
muted?
you're on mute.
Oh, he's
Yes,
muted.
he's on mute.
I apologize for that.
No worries.
There are about a little over 4,000 colleges and universities in this country that enroll about a little over 18 million students. And that's just the undergraduate level. Earlier this spring, Congress is under the CARES Act was awarded about $12 billion for colleges and universities to adapt to the realities of the shift that occurred in the spring when everything had to be shut down across the United States. However, colleges and universities are asking Congress for an additional over $100 billion in order for colleges and universities to be able to not only continue to adapt to the realities of virtual instruction and all the technology that goes with that, the support that students need in terms of laptops, access to secure, reliable broadband, but also all the unbudgeted expenses that colleges and universities must have, will have going forward to make sure that students, faculty, and administrators are safe by buying PPE, personal protective equipment, buying the tests that they need to buy, being able to reconfigure their campuses to ensure social distancing. The list goes on and on. Colleges and universities will be part of the solution of the recovery of the recession and the pandemic that we're suffering right now. Colleges and universities need assistance from the federal government in order to do that safely and as soon as possible.
Excellent. Thank you. Sindy, you're up.
Thank you so much for that question, Andrea. And what I will say is that, what we're seeing, particularly with this administration, is politics of exclusion, where what we see with Secretary Betsy DeVos, it's excluding our young leaders, our immigrant leaders from accessing some of the resources that they would have been able to access. And again, this is, policy decisions that are being made by this administration in a very intentional way through the politics of exclusion. And, what we want Congress to do is to take action, right? We know that Senator Mitch McConnell is a big wall and a big block to making sure that communities of color are receiving this help. And what we want is for Congress to allocate enough funding so that our kids, our children, and by our, I say that in a very plural manner, individuals who are going to public schools can overcome the challenges of COVID-19. We also want to make sure that that we preserve federal education funds for public schools. But, the points that are being made by Karla and Luis are so important because we actually did a poll with the AFT to the teachers, to administrators, to the parents. And what we found is that, school teachers, administrators, the parents would feel a lot better if the schools, one, had the PPE in place to protect not only the teachers, but also the students. Understanding that the students also impact the family unit. If they're going into family units where there's multi-generational homes where you have a mother, father, maybe a grandparent, or a sibling that is younger. So in instances, you have 3 different generations living in the same family unit. We also want to make sure that we support the learning of immigrant students. And again, this is really where we see the politics of exclusion, particularly in the Senate and with the administration, where our students with immigrant status are being specifically targeted under this administration. And this just undermines really the education and the future of our country as we look at that increase that Luis so greatly pointed out in his chart, where we are the future of higher ed, right? It's over 70% increase. And lastly, that we want to make sure that we also are very inclusive of the needs of rural communities, and that includes our farm workers, and making sure that we have protections in place for farm working families. And I will tell you that what we're seeing right now out of Washington State and the wildfires, where there was an orchard who dropped off over 200 of their farm workers on H-2A visas, is something that should not be happening in America, and something that we should have an outreach over. We do know that they went and picked them up after because they were getting a bad rep for doing the wrong thing. But you know, Andrea, as we look at these issues, again, it's going to be up to us to speak out, to bring light to these issues. And I also want to make a note here, because I know we're talking about the federal government, but the local and state government also have policies that impact our students. And I know so many brave governors and localities that stood up to what this national mandate that President Trump wanted to do, along with Secretary DeVos, of having the schools return to in-person learning. And immediately we saw that schools had to shut down within the first day because they were having outbreaks of COVID-19 within their student bodies. And so what I would say is that this is a disgrace to our country and America, as we see a standing precedent playing politics with the lives of our children, playing politics with the lives of our teachers, and playing politics with COVID-19 at a time when we need true leadership to make sure that we as Americans are protected.
Thank you, Sindy. And to follow up on some of the points you made, I want to ask a question directed at Luis. Earlier in the year, Congress offered stimulus aid to college students facing financial insecurity, but only the students who participated in federal aid programs were eligible to receive that money, which shut out a lot of DACA recipients, international students, immigrant students, like Sindy mentioned. And going into also what Sindy was kind of talking about, what can federal, state, and local governments do to support these students who are very much our future moving forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. In fact, Congress did not impose a limitation on the eligibility for the about $6 billion that were directed at college students. That was only the Department of Education determined that you had to be Title IV eligible, which means you were eligible for federal student aid. And beyond the groups that you also mentioned, surprisingly, for folks who don't follow this as closely, it actually also excluded many veterans who don't use federal student aid, because the Veterans Affairs has their own GI benefit for higher education. So it created a lot of problems. People who had prior drug convictions, who are on the mend, who are trying to get an education so they don't fall back on that criminal activity, they were also excluded from this eligibility. That was a heartless decision by this Department of Education leadership in doing that. What can colleges and state government, local governments do? They need to try to combine whatever resources they have access to provide that support to these individuals who are part of the academic community, who are vital contributors to the education that occurs, not just because they're members of the student body, but also they contribute a lot of other activities to the community, the financial needs of that institution. So this is a big challenge for institutions and local and state governments in the era of the pandemic with reduced tax revenue, but it is an important part. And AASCU is part of the effort in Washington, D.C. to make sure that if there is additional aid coming, that it is in fact made available to all students, not just a portion of them.
Excellent. Anyone else, any other panelists want to add to that question? Okay, with that, I'll move on. I have a question for Karla now, because a lot of school systems are thinking creatively to keep students from falling behind and to keep that gap, that learning gap from getting so big. Tennessee, for example, is recruiting like 1,000 college students to help tutor kids. Some districts are making digital summer learning available. What else can be done on a local level in our school districts to kind of fill these gaps and avoid students falling really behind?
Well, there's a couple of things that local communities can do. I think that we should capitalize on utilizing buildings that are not being used right now because they're closed in the pandemic. So for example, libraries, public libraries, community centers. If we really care about children that are struggling and we want to give extra resources to these children, what we can do is open up these centers where you have very small, very limited, maybe 5 students to 1 teacher, giving more direct instruction, being socially distant, making sure that everything else that is required and needed under these COVID circumstances are implemented, and give them that extra attention that they need. We know that the achievement gap already exists. We know that it's directly correlated to socioeconomic conditions of a family. And so if we already know those things and those numbers exist and we can already see them, what we can do is that we can give additional resources to these families by making sure that, during the pandemic, they get extra help. And, the extra help is going to come in those ways where you are able to create small classroom environments where students are learning, kind of like what you were saying with, having like a hybrid type of summer school program where different communities have done those type of things. But, I think that that's important that, the buildings are already there. They exist. They've already been built. They're already equipped with a lot of the things and the materials that our educators would need. We just need access to them with somebody that can guide these students along. But of course, that means that there needs to be funding for that. And so again, this is about local communities, state, Congress, the federal government. Everybody needs to be of the mindset that we need to help, and make sure that we give resources where they've already been needed so that we can double down and really make an impact in a very positive way under very unfortunate circumstances.
Excellent. The following question is open to all panelists. The pandemic has highlighted the need for training to use online skills and digital resources as more learning moves towards a virtual setting. Just a few weeks ago, we saw the 2 Latinx little girls huddled over a phone in front of a Taco Bell to try to use the hotspot. What federal, state, or local policies need to be in place to ensure that students have access to these much needed resources moving forward?
So I'll go for it first, if that's all right with you.
I'm sorry, I forgot to call on somebody. Go ahead,
Okay.
Yes.
So, this information is out there as well. We know that Black and Brown communities have much less access to internet, even dial-up, which you guys, the young people that are looking at this webinar probably have no idea what a dial-up is. It's that old AOL. Yeah, you remember that? Maybe no. So yeah, nobody knows what that is anymore. So we know that between 19 to 17% of Black and Hispanic communities don't have access to internet connectivity. And so, you can create places where there are it's just free access to Wi-Fi. In communities that that exist where there is that digital gap, where there is no connectivity, why not create hotspots where that children can access their education, since a lot of kids are still going virtual. Also, making sure that the proper investments are made at the local, district levels to make sure that devices are available. So for example, here in Miami-Dade, more than 200,000 devices were distributed at the onset of the pandemic. Because we knew that there were a lot of children in our communities that did not have access to a device. And so some of those devices that were given were not just laptops, but they also gave out cell phones so that the children could use the cell phones as a hotspot to get the connection that they needed so that they can get online and connect with their teachers. But this is happening not just in urban districts like Miami-Dade. You have very rural communities as well where this is happening also. And so one thing I want to make sure everybody understands, you cannot replace a teacher. A teacher is going to be 1,000 times better in person than in a virtual setting. And teachers want to be in person. And they want to be able to use, all the pedagogy and everything that they've learned in their universities to really interact with students. And so this is making, this is really making us become innovators in so many different ways. We've had to learn now how to interact and look at students and try to look at them in their eyes through this computer and see, are they okay? What are their social emotional needs? What is going on? Is there some kind of negative impact that I can tell that's happening through this computer screen to find out if they need counseling service, psychological services, because our students' families have been impacted by this as well. And so, we need the social workers, the school psychologists, but of course, in order for us to even access and have an idea that these things are happening, we need to be able to connect with our students. And we can't connect if we continue to have this digital divide. And unless we have access to internet in every community, in every space, where there are these community spaces and centers where children don't have to run to the Taco Bell, to try to get internet access, but that we create these spaces for our community, we're still going to continue to have haves and have nots and continue to make that achievement gap much wider as time passes by.
I would just add to what has been mentioned by Karla that we need to make sure that there's additional funding for the Education Stabilization Fund, which delivers public K-12 schools the support that they need in providing ongoing teaching and learning for children, whether it's in person or virtual. And I also want to mention that we want to make sure that there's funding for the Assistive Technology Act of 1998, which specifically is for virtual learning, and it's to assist also children with disabilities. We forget oftentimes that within our student population, we also have children with disabilities. And, I did want to mention that absolutely the technology gap, the broadband gap is a real one. 1 in 3 of our Latino households and children do not have access to technology, do not have access to broadband. And one of the different courses or discourses rather that we're hearing across different states is if internet or broadband access becomes a public utility. And that's really an interesting discourse that we're looking at, we're investigating, we're researching, because then this would force the companies to provide this service. I already do know, though, for the students that maybe are experiencing this challenge, that many of the companies, whether it's AT&T, whether it's Verizon, whether it's Charter Communications or even T-Mobile, do offer low-income access to broadband. It's anywhere from $9.99 to maybe $19.99, depending on the company. But I also know that the school system is really working diligently, as Karla mentioned, to provide the technology and the broadband to the students. And I will tell you, Andrea, that at LULAC, the very first call that we got was from a teacher in San Antonio who was desperate to find laptops for her students, because at that time, unfortunately, the education system was not prepared to equip her students, and so her students were missing out on their classes. So she contacted us, we jumped into action because that's who we are, that's what we do. And we were able to provide the 10 laptops that she needed for the 10 students that were missing those laptops. One of our LULAC members literally walked into the store, bought the laptops, and then distributed them. But not only distributed them, but also taught the parents the very basic functions of the laptop. And so many of us forget that within our community, there's also this challenge of literacy and adoption. And I can share a personal story here. On the third day that my 5-year-old son started kindergarten, virtual kindergarten. I had to go to a meeting outside of my house, and my mom was here with my 5-year-old, and Victor pushed the power button, which then, you know, the computer went into all kinds of direction. And if you can only imagine, my mom, who has not used a laptop, I had to walk her through where the power button was, what the 2 lines were, the username and the password, how to get to there to be able to put in the student number, and then how to even do shift to be able to capitalize one of the letters for that. That was a 45-minute process. And my heart is just, I just keep thinking of the parents who maybe are not, you know, computer literate, who have never used a computer, who are now struggling with their children and figuring out this online learning. And I also think, Andrea, of the parents who have to leave their houses every single day, right? Surgeon General Adams has stated that 5 out of 6 Latinos have to leave their houses every single day to work and get paid. What does that mean for our children? That means that maybe oftentimes our children are being left alone, or they're being left with an older sibling, or, you know, the parents are coming together with other parents informally to figure out this school schedule so that there's at least an adult in the room that's multi-managing the children's education. But can you just imagine our children trying to learn this remotely on their own? And just also a shout out to the teachers, Karla, and I really do think that our teachers are heroes, because they're trying to do the impossible during a global pandemic of making sure that our children are getting the education that they so desperately need. But I think beyond that, I think, you know, making sure we understand already what existing resources are there that some of these technology companies are providing is important. But also we need to pressure the federal government to make sure that they include funding that includes this technology gap, and also its access and adoption into any of the bills that may come before Congress. Because what we know is that if that is not included, our children will continue to be left behind, and that this will be something that impacts us not only for the next year, but for decades. And so it's something that we're keeping a close eye on, because it is that important and that critical. And again, I think we also need to make sure that we are involved and engaged and listen to our young youth who are tuning in. I know sometimes our parents don't speak English. I know sometimes you have to be the translator or the interpreter and trying to communicate to the school system. Unfortunately, we're going to have to do this together, but there's individuals like Karla that exist to make sure that, you know, we're speaking out, that we are protected. There's the PTA also that exists for the parents, and I know that they're trying to do a better job in increasing Latino parents within the PTA, and there's organizations like LULAC that exist to make sure that your voice is uplifted. So just remember that every single movement has always been done by our youth, and that you play a critical role in the changes that we see. You are the hero of your story. We are here as a civil rights organization to absolutely continue pushing and pressuring, but you also have to take an active role.
Thank you, Sindy. Luis, is there anything you'd like to add to that, follow up on a college university level?
Yeah, there's no question that the disparities in access to reliable, private, consistent broadband internet access is also exists in higher education. The numbers are much more different though. There's about 57 million students in K-12 in this country. There's about 18 million college students. 1 million of those are about international students. However, that same table I shared with you at the beginning about how mainly Hispanics, but also African Americans and Asian students are increasing their rate of attainment and access to higher education. We also know that the majority of those individuals could be either low income, first generation, or students of color. And we just need to be paying attention to the news over the last 6 months about the challenges that those communities are having in being able to provide, again, reliable access to their education, whether it be the 5th grade or their 3rd year of college. So we are imploring Congress to put more money into the stabilization fund that Sindy referenced earlier, because there's a version for it in K-12 and there's a version for it in higher education. And those are the pots of money that would flow through the universities for them to contact their students and work in those communities to provide them with access that they need.
Excellent. Thank you. I want to move on now to a question for Karla. Karla, like we talked about, Miami-Dade schools are set to open soon. Are you confident that classrooms in your county, but also across the country, are ready to reopen in terms of safety? How can local and state governments support teachers through this process as well? Because that's another big factor in this conversation.
I actually don't feel that we are quite there yet. And that is why the start date was actually pushed back and was further. You know, originally they were going to try to reopen schools next week. But really the major concern is, you know, what is happening at the school sites. We see that there are school sites that do not have the proper social distancing in the classrooms. That means that their class roster has to be reduced. You know, for a long time, teachers have been saying the best way to teach students is to have small class sizes because you give more direct instruction. And, you know, that's during a regular year. Now more than ever during a pandemic where you know that this is a virus that's highly contagious and that the more separation you have, the less likely it is that you can infect a person. We need to have small class sizes. And so rosters need to, you know, be whittled down. We need to make sure that there's proper markings throughout the schools. You know, what is 6 feet of separation? Because as, you know, our colleague Sindy said, she's got a 5-year-old. I have a 6-year-old. And, you know, they don't know what 6 feet of separation is. They need some kind of visual cue to let them know this is where I need to be standing. This is how far I need to be from the rest of my peers. You know, we also know that there needs to be proper ventilation. So you're from, you know, you're here in Miami and you know that, you know, unlike other places in the rest of the country, like in Miami, we cannot live, literally, we cannot live without air conditioning, because we'll melt. So, you know, we need really good ventilation. That means that the filters need to be a certain grade so that they can filter out, you know, any of the viruses and these aerosols that exist in the classrooms. You know, up in the north, they have a different kind of ventilation system. So are their ventilation systems equipped and ready so that, you know, all these particles aren't in the air? You know, making sure that we have the proper funding, and this takes federal funds to make sure that we have the PPE that's necessary in our schools. We need hand washing stations. We need to make sure that kids are wearing their masks. I mean, there's all these additional things because we cannot share our textbooks. We cannot share the normal things that we would share as kids because our schools are made to be socializing centers. That is how a lot of us learn the things that we learn, especially babies. You know, when we're talking about early childhood education, we know that wearing a mask is not conducive for them because they're actually learning how to formulate sounds and words by mimicking us. And so they need to see our face and they need to see the expressions that we make and the way we make our, you know, our sounds, how we enunciate things by looking at them. They can't do that with a mask. And so, you know, there's so many different things that are required, and you think about special needs students, and then, you know, how do we take care of them, knowing that we're going to be in closer contact with them, knowing that they need additional resources. You know, how do we provide all these things for them? And, you know, I think that it's very crucial that all of our communities understand that it is because our teachers care so much about students and want to make sure that their environment is safe, is that a lot of teachers have expressed concern over the restart of school, not because virtual teaching is something that they look forward to. It's actually super taxing. I mean, I feel like our days have been elongated. There are no time limits for things. We're available all the time. You know, creating dynamic lessons where you can put up a PowerPoint or, you know, really try to interact and engage with students when you're trying to figure out who is captivating, who's having an aha moment and who's not. And you're like flipping through the Zoom screens to see if everybody got it. It's very, very difficult. And so I know that the majority of my colleagues want so bad to be back in the classroom because that's where they make the best connections. But you can mitigate learning loss. And this is what I tell everybody. You can mitigate learning loss. You can come back, you can assess, you can evaluate, you can reevaluate, you can try to put in techniques and strategies to help children, overcome anything that they may have lost during this time. But you cannot mitigate loss of life. And until we are sure that our school sites are equipped with the things that they need, that the safety measures are being implemented, that we're not cutting corners, that we're not being stingy with kids. We can't be stingy right now. We can't say we're gonna get hand disinfectant that has no alcohol in it. That's not gonna work. COVID does not get killed with foaming, antibacterial soap that doesn't have alcohol in it. There's certain things that we need. So we can't cut corners. We have to ensure that all these things are there, that they're implemented, because the safety of our kids' well-being means that this is not going to continue to spread, means that we can go back to some sense of normalcy. But our teachers are scared. They're scared because they're seeing that a lot of districts, because of the lack of funding that has existed for such a long time, now more than ever, those things that they need that are necessary, the hygiene, making sure that they have custodians and janitors that are doing daily cleansing, all these things, they're not seeing it. And it brings a lot of caution, red flags. And they want to make sure we get this right. Because if we get this wrong, we're putting people's lives at risk.
Thank you, Karla, for that. This next question is directed towards Sindy. According to a recent study, the average learning loss for students during the pandemic is 7 months, but for Hispanic students, it's more than 9 months, and low-income students, it could be more than a year. And the study also indicated that this could also lead to increased high school dropout rates. Can you talk about that and what we can do to ensure our most vulnerable students are staying motivated to stay in school?
Thank you for that question, Andrea. And I will tell you that I think so many of our unions, so many of our teachers, and so many of our parents are trying to figure it out. We know that the homework gap is a real thing. We know that the learning gap is a real thing. And now we have the technology gap, which has only increased and expanded. And I think, we're shining a bright spot because many of the students are not able to go in person to learn. We know for sure, Andrea, that this is why we need to push for aggressive policies to make sure that there's education in addressing the needs for low-income communities, addressing the needs for communities of color, addressing the need for communities who have disabilities, because our children are being impacted. And along with that, and I've seen in the chat and also in the Q&A, the question about mental health resources. And this is an issue that I know, we have been talking about, I would say since May, when our VP for the Northeast, Cardona, mentioned to me, we were having a conversation about education, and she flagged for me, I live in a suburban community where I have the privilege to be able to get out of my house, walk around, cross the street, and go into a public park. But many of our children in city settings and urban settings, unfortunately, don't have that privilege, right? They have been in hotspots like New York City, and some of them have not left the apartment in more than 5 months. And if you can just imagine what this is doing to the psychology of our children, to the mental health well-being of our children, this is something that as we speak with different governors, as we speak with different members of Congress, as we speak with different education school systems, we are bringing to light. I know that there are different programs that university health systems are trying to put in place. I know Johns Hopkins, for example, has been doing a children curriculum for young children so that they're able to experience something out of the normal that's fun, that's creative, that gets them moving, even if it's inside closed quarters. But I know just in general, Andrea, to your question and going back to that very important question, we know that we have work to do. And this is what, this is actually what I referenced when I talked about that the implications of what is happening right now is going to be decades in the making, right? This is where we're going to see our children, unfortunately, feeling even more left behind because they are not getting, the different tools that they need. And with and I also just want to acknowledge that, our children are literally doing miracles with what they have, right? Like they're trying to do homework and listen to classroom lessons from a mobile smartphone, not being equipped with the proper technology, not even sometimes having the hotspot, and also acknowledging that in a household where you have multiple children who are attending school, that what we're seeing is that the children are having to rotate those devices in school systems that aren't able to provide the technology. So what we know for sure is that this is something that we're going to have to grapple with, not only in the months ahead, but in the years ahead. And I think for us right now, as a nonprofit organization at the national level, what we have been doing through Forward Driving Dreams and what we have been doing through other educational programs is pivoting to have mentorships available for our students, making sure that our students understand that we are here for them, that we want to make sure that every possible resource that we can exhaust, we will exhaust it. And that one of the things that we are looking at is making sure that they have access to mentors, right, and tutors, something that a lot of Latino families cannot afford and do not have access to. I also think, Andrea, we have to completely think outside of the box and think of how we can partner and be creative with local school systems and shaping these solutions. And what I will say is that Latinos are often underrepresented when it comes to, one, being in the PTA, but also being in the school board meetings, being present when these conversations are taking place. And this is where we have to pay special close attention, right? Just as important as is Black Lives Matter, just as important as is the census and the elections, we have to be paying attention to when the next school board meeting is going to happen so we can address these issues. Because if our local officials do not know that this is an issue, they will not act on it. And this is why we need to be very vigilant and very proactive in making sure we know that.
Excellent, thank you so much. And touching on the mental health question, I want to thank Samantha Medina, and had another student ask us about mental health, Daniela Salazar. So thank you for that question. I do want to get back to that, but first I want to ask Luis more on this possible increased dropout rates. I don't know if this is something you guys have thought about. You showed us that figure of over 70% for increase in Latino college and university enrollment. Is that something that we are thinking may decrease after this pandemic?
That's a great question. That is ultimately one of the big unknowns we had facing this fall term. But this week, we actually began to receive the first set of data. And we were very surprised at what we are seeing. For example, the higher ed community was expecting about a 15% drop in college enrollment this fall. The number actually turns out to be 2.5%. So that is a big difference. A lot of students are still enrolled, so thank goodness for that. So let's tease out some of the differences that we are seeing. Unfortunately, the largest drop that we see, that 2.5, the largest amount of those are at community colleges, which are seeing a 7.5% drop compared to last year's enrollment. Private universities have 3.8%. Public four-year schools have 0.4%. However, for the institutions that AASCU represents, we saw an increase of 0.5%. So we know not all universities are created equal. Not all of them are as open and welcoming to the students and the families in their communities. Our institutions are. So I think that explains part of that difference. But also the drop of enrollment was not equal among race and ethnic groups. For Hispanics, the drop has been 3.3%. However, I am happy to share with all of you that that is, of all the groups, that is in fact the lowest drop. So Hispanics are still enrolling in colleges and universities this term, and we hope that trend continues. Even most curious, the rate of Hispanics who are accessing graduate schools went up by 14%. So the signs that we're hearing, the early signs of what we're seeing in terms of fall enrollment are varied, but for our community, for higher education, for Hispanics, it is among the most positive. So we are encouraged by that so far.
That's great news. Thank you for sharing that with us. Okay, now I do want to open the floor to all panelists to answer the question that a few students have asked about mental health. Apart from academic funding challenges, is there anything set in motion to help both students and teachers with their mental health? That question is from Samantha Medina. The floor is open to anybody who wants to tackle that question.
So I would say that this is something that we certainly have to put more of an emphasis on. And I think that, you know, that leads to some of the things that we ask in terms of policy to change as well. In a lot of places, we see that they have not made any waivers to standardized testing. And so here we are in a pandemic. We know that schools are closed, that schools are going virtual, and you know that these achievement gaps are getting broader and broader. And we have policymakers who have not provided waivers to these, in general, just to districts. We know that we are living a pandemic. It's not just a national pandemic. It is an international, worldwide pandemic. And so the learning losses that are occurring to us here are not to us alone. They're happening at a worldwide level. Every 6-year-old, every 5-year-old, every 14-year-old is experiencing conditions like this because schools have stopped for every single child for some amount of time, and things have changed everywhere. And so I think that we need to take a step back and take a pause and say, okay, well, why is it that we are striving so hard to meet this threshold that we ourselves implemented and made, when right now we know that there's something larger that we need to be paying attention to? So when you talk about mental health, I think that that's it's really important to note that during these times when we're interacting with our students and we're trying to connect with them and we're trying to make sure that they're okay, and we're finding out if, you know, they've experienced any loss, if their families are okay, you know, is there unemployment, you know, are they getting the nutritional needs that they need? You know, are they getting food? Which is another big important topic. You know, when you talk about all these things, you have to prioritize. And when you see that there are policymakers that are saying you have to continue to do standardized testing and have this mentality of teachers need to be making sure that children reach these benchmarks, there are other benchmarks that are important. There are other social emotional factors that need to be considered. And I think that, you know, everybody is experiencing a lot of stress. I know teachers are exhausted from being, you know, virtual all the time and looking at the screen, and students are as well. And, you know, it's taking a toll on the physical body as well as the stress on the mental stress that this has because of all the different factors that are correlated to it. But I don't feel like there's enough of an emphasis on it, unfortunately, because there's always these other political factors that are, you know, attached to education. And some people see the benefits of, you know, doing that because they want to tie education funding to how districts do or schools do on standardized tests. And it's very unfortunate, but I agree that there should be more focus on mental health, not just for the pandemic, but just in general. I mean, we see so many things that are happening with the school shootings, with Black Lives Matter. I mean, there's so many things, so many stresses that are happening in our communities right now that we need it more than ever.
And I would just add, Andrea, that, you know, what we're seeing, and this is a new term that I learned, that our communities are facing compounded trauma, and that we're seeing this over and over, you know, in communities who are experiencing unemployment. And what we already know is that, you know, 50+% of Latino businesses will permanently close their doors during this pandemic. And you know, that's even being conservative to a certain measure. So we already know that our families are facing financial insecurity and already, you know, trying to figure out where they're going to live. We already know, as Karla pointed out, that so many of our children are facing food insecurity. And if you can just imagine a child who is hungry, it will be very hard for them to learn. And again, to the example that I gave you before, where parents are already having to decide, you know, whether to buy the basic staples or buy laundry detergent, that's a very hard decision for a parent to make. And I would just also add the layer of immigration status, because we are living currently under an administration who has persecuted, who has declared war on our immigrant community from the very beginning, where so many immigrant parents who may lack status or who may live in mixed status families are scared of what may happen to them. What would happen to their children if unfortunately they are caught by ICE. And it's, really interesting, because what we saw in Oregon, as we saw different protests and unidentified vehicles and agents step in there, has been happening in the Latino and immigrant community for years, where ICE has come in with unidentified vehicles and unidentified personnel into our communities to grasp and get our immigrant members in our community. So know that, yes, we are paying attention, but I would say long term, this is where we have work to do, where we need to continue to advocate for resources at all levels to make sure that our children and also our teachers get the assistance and help that they need. And lastly, I did want to mention that LULAC was part of an initiative through the federal government. This happened in the last few weeks, called How Right Now. It's also available in Spanish, and it's a free resource for individuals just to check in and see where they are, whether they're experiencing anxiety or stress, or, what those different triggers are, so that we ourselves can also try to mitigate some of this. But absolutely, we will continue to push at the federal level and at all levels for funding for mental health. It's a very important issue.
Thank you. Luis, did you want to add to that?
I'll just share that in the negotiations that are occurring in Congress right now, to determine what the federal budget will be come October 1st, the beginning of the federal fiscal year, the House of Representatives, led by Speaker Pelosi, have been insisting that money be included in the agreement to help supplement nutritional assistance at schools for low-income students. And this was a demand that she was very persistent on, and the deal was struck. That also includes that money, and the other side wanted assistance for farmers. So that agreement helped balance the possibility of the government remaining open come October 1st. The House has approved this. Now it's moving on to the Senate. So that was clearly a victory for these individuals and families in need.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing. I want to get to one student question before we go over to closing remarks. Paola Grandi asked, do you think grading and workloads during distance learning should be different than in-person learning? And I will open the floor to that. I guess, Karla, you can start first.
Distance learning and in-person learning are definitely two different beasts. Everything that I learned when I went to college and university taught us all the pedagogy that we needed to obviously interact in person. Virtual teaching has been, quite the pivot for a lot of folks. And when you talk about older teachers who maybe are not as technologically savvy as younger teachers, not to say that all of them, but in some cases that's the truth. It has been even more taxing on them because they're learning all these different platforms, and they may be extraordinary teachers in person because they're exceptional. They've been doing this for so long. They have so much experience. They've really mastered their craft. But when you've shifted them now to a virtual learning manner, it's really changed a lot of things. And we know, that research also shows and indicates that, in-person learning is by far, more effective for students. And I'm a special ed teacher. And so I know that special needs students have, because of their different abilities, also have different modalities or different ways of learning that are more beneficial to them. And so it makes it very difficult to be able to, make those changes, attribute, what those learning styles are in a virtual setting. And so we've seen, a lot of children that are struggling. They're exhausted, and we just want to do it the right way, but it has to be safe. And I think that's the call that all educators have been making, that we want to go back into our classrooms, but we want to ensure that there are safety precautions that are being met so that our kids could do well. And, you know, this is the time for, you know, our federal government to really help us in ways that they can. I know that Congresswoman Shalala down here in Miami just signed a letter to Congress saying that they want to create a different kind of package since they know that the HEROES Act hasn't moved. But we need to figure out who's doing what to help support and promote the things that we're talking about. And so 2 shameless plugs. If you haven't done the census, make sure you do the census, because that helps us get federal funding. And we're talking about federal funding and federal policies and representation here. So this all connects. You got to get counted. You know, they don't check for immigration status. They don't check for felony, you know, records, anything like that. They want to make sure that they count everybody that's living in a residence at a particular time. So make sure that everyone you know gets counted. And then I would say, make sure that you go out and vote. See what's happening, see who the people are that are really supporting the agendas and the initiatives that we need, and make sure that you support them. And maybe if you're a student, you don't have money to contribute to their campaign, volunteer. Do some phone banking, text. You know, I'm not gonna say go door knocking right now because it's COVID times and we wanna make sure we're kind of safe. But make sure that you volunteer for campaigns and that you support people that have and believe in the communities that you represent and want to do right by the greater, you know, by the greater population. So those are my 2 shameless plugs. Make sure that you do your census and make sure that you go out and vote.
Okay, guys, we have about 7 minutes to go. So I'm going to open the floor for closing remarks. And I will start with Luis.
Thank you. I will very briefly use some visuals to make my point. This is the rate of voting participation by Hispanics. More than half of the eligible individuals do not vote. That is a big limitation in our community. In Washington, D.C., in the work that I do in government relations, we live and die by this statement. You're either at the table or on the menu. If you're not out there advocating, asking, talking, working to ensure that your fair share is allotted to the programs, to the individuals, to the needs that you care most about, somebody else is. So I leave you with this image. You're either the pancake or the person holding the fork and the knife. And that power only resides in each of you. But also, you have a role to play in encouraging your friends, your family members, your parents, your siblings, yourself. Remember, you're either the pancake or the person holding the fork and the knife. So you decide.
I love that. Thank you so much, Luis. Sindy?
First and foremost, thank you so much for the opportunity. And, you know, as I think of this concluding message, I want you to remember that this is probably one of the most important elections of our lifetimes. And that, you know, if you're 18 and you're not registered, that is your homework today, to make sure that you register. But I also want to remind you that oftentimes what we do is that we give our power away. And we give our power away every single day when we don't influence others, when we don't speak up, and when we don't participate. And I just want to remind you again that every single major movement has been led by our youth. Every single major movement. And in fact, every 30 seconds, a Latino in the US turns 18. Every 30 seconds. What that means is that every single year, 1 million Latinos are eligible to register to vote simply for turning 18. Every presidential election cycle, 4 million Latinos are eligible to register to vote simply for turning 18 over the past 4 years. This year, 2020, Latinos become the largest minority voting bloc. But we will not be powerful if the 32 million Latinos who are eligible to register do not register and do not vote. And so what can you do? One, if you're not 18 yet, absolutely volunteer in some way or another. You know, figure out which candidate best represents your values, best represents what you stand for, and give some of your time to participate and understand how elections work and how campaigns work. Second, influence your family, friends, and members. And I just want to ask, you don't have to raise your hand, not that I can see you, but how many of you are on TikTok? How many of you are on Instagram? How many of you are on Twitter or Facebook? How many of you have these different social media platforms that you're communicating with others, and your message can be driving that message of voting, even if you yourself are not yet eligible to register to vote? And then I will tell you this, and this is a powerful lesson that I learned over 10 years ago, and that is that our family members are the influencers, the biggest influencers within our families. So just to give you an example, if I came to your neighborhood, this is pre-COVID-19, and knocked on your door, and let's just say that for a miracle, your mom, your dad, your tia, your tío, your cousin opened the door and decided not to not open the door, they would hear me out because it would be nice, and they'd be like, thank you for the information, and close the door. But if you ask them, like, mami, papi, ya se ha registrado, sabe cuándo es las elecciones, there's a big differentiator there, and that is that they trust you because they know you. And so I want you to not give your power away, and understand the power that you hold as an individual to influence others. And lastly, I want to leave you with two things, and that is that every moment is an organizing opportunity, every person a potential activist, and every minute a chance to change the world. And one of my favorite activists and heroes said that, Dolores Huerta. And as we look at November 3rd, and if you don't know what November 3rd is, that's the day of our elections here in the US, please put it on your calendar like it's your birthday, like maybe it's your quinceañera, or maybe it's just a good day to know. Because we want to make sure that November 3rd and before November 3rd, we're early voting by mail, and getting that information to our community. But as we think of our greatest act of disobedience, as we think of the best way that we protest, the best way that we show up for our community, that we act, we have to vote. That is the greatest defiance that we can make in 2020 to create the change that we want to see. Thank you.
Thank you, Sindy. Karla?
Look, I think that my colleagues have been so eloquent in their words, and they have made, really profound and precise statements of exactly what we should be focusing on. And if you're not taking notes, I mean, the word of the day was vote. So, it is about being registered. It is about being active, civically engaged, and making sure that you're voting for those people who represent your values and represent your communities. I represent a teachers union, a labor organization. We are extremely important when we talk about working people, about workers' rights, about ensuring that social justice is fought for in our communities. So whenever you are part of the workforce, when you're part of labor, I hope that you will also join a labor union, and that you will help to continue the movement of fighting for, the middle class and the disenfranchised, the marginalized folks, and making sure that we get the equity that we deserve, because we're still fighting for things that are common knowledge. Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away. And, today, we've been seeing all, the beautiful celebrations to her life, giving her the honor that she so deserves. And, she fought for things that we have, me as a woman now, rights that I can talk about, because she was there to fight for them and make sure that the legal system was just. My grandmother passed away 4 weeks ago. She was 99. This country has only had the right for women to vote for 100 years. She would have been 100 actually this next week. So, these are all things that have happened within our generation. So, we're ruthless now. You're ruthless. I'm ruthless. We're ruthless. Go out and vote. Make sure that you fight for the things that you care about, things that matter, and make sure that you always remember que sí se puede.
Sí se puede, that's right. Well, with that, I will conclude our Education Town Hall Policy Solutions for COVID-19. I want to thank all of the panelists for being here today. It has been a pleasure and an honor to be among you guys, and also to all the students who have been listening in and asking questions and being a part of this very important conversation. Thank you to
all. What a wonderful event. Thank you, Sindy. Thank you, Luis. Thank you, Karla. Muchísimas gracias, Andrea. Thank you, students, for your participation. Students, this concludes today's workshops. We'll see you tomorrow Please remember to wear your Washington Youth Leadership Seminar t-shirts. This concludes our town hall. Thank you, guys.
Thank you all so much.
Gracias.
Bye.
Bye-bye.